we're definitely live.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm Tina Antolini. I'm a producer on Rough Translation. And I think each of us is going to introduce ourselves first of all. Gregory, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. Gregory Warner, the host of Rough Translation, former correspondent for NPR.
Daniel?
I'm Daniel Estrin. I'm speaking to you live from Jerusalem, and I am NPR's correspondent in Jerusalem.
And last but definitely not least, Lou.
I'm Lou Olkowski, and I am the editor in Rough Translation right now.
Well, we're very glad that you are here, whether here presently with us or here watching this in the future. Today, we're going to be talking about finding the podcast narrative in news reporting and how to sort of adapt news and beat reporting with foreign correspondents into sort of more narrative stories. And we're going to have a special focus on a recent episode of ours that came out in May called Hotel Corona. And we'll tell you a little bit more about that shortly. But I wanted to start out by throwing this to Gregory to just give you a little bit of an overview of Rough Translation as a show and what we're trying to do.
Great. Yeah, just in case folks are not familiar with the show or just a little bit about it. So Rough Translation, most of the stories we do are international. I guess it's an NPR's international podcast. But it's also trying to grapple with that idea of what international stories are, or what you might expect when you think of that term in journalism. So my experience as an international correspondent, especially in the places I had been reporting, like Afghanistan and Russia, Ukraine, as well as East Africa, was that oftentimes you tell stories from there at length in a podcast way, and they can be either the problem of being too exotic or too actually familiar, too universal. And what I mean is that either it would be very much, okay, that nothing like that would happen here, this is very much from over there, and sort of not related to our own lives, or just, and I think this happens also, it's just you emphasize the human being, the human story. You don't really get a sense of them being any different from us or having any different cultural history, or the cultural differences are at least minimized or erased. So Rough Translation started with this principle that, okay, the world is flat. We are all going through the same thing in some way, the same world. Yes, there are crisis zones, there are war zones, and there are poorer countries, but you can be in a rich, quote unquote, stable country and still be buffeted by the forces of well, you name it, nationalism, populism, corruption. This podcast kind of was thought about in 2015, greenlit in 2016, and I guess came out with our first season in 2017. So it was just around the time when I think that there was this feeling that America was going through a lot of things that previously we felt immune from. And so, but at the same time, we're not going to universalize the experience too much. We're going to emphasize cultural difference and learn from it and kind of step into an experience which we have to translate, which gave rise to the idea of Rough Translation. And so obviously coronavirus and COVID-19 bore out this thesis of the show in an extreme degree, because if the idea was we're all kind of going through the same thing in different ways, we literally are going through this same pandemic, but responding to it so differently. And similarly, I think our most recent stories about race and the aftermath of George Floyd's killing, as well as the Black Lives Matter movement. So in the wake of COVID-19 and coronavirus, we kind of pivoted. We have been a seasonal show. We started just coming out every 2 weeks, and that's what we have been basically doing. We're a bi-weekly show now. And this was one of our, I guess, it was one of our coronavirus.
It's like maybe third
stories.
into the COVID pandemic stories. And maybe I'll jump in and just tell you a little bit about this story in case you haven't heard it, though we highly recommend you listen to it. This story is about what we've nicknamed, and what the guests of this place nicknamed, Hotel Corona. It's the Dan Hotel in Jerusalem, which was leased by the government to house recovering COVID-19 patients, about 200 people. They all already had the coronavirus. So in some ways, it was like this surreal alternate universe where while the rest of us outside were in lockdown and having to socially distance, the people who were inside this hotel could be close to one another, give hugs. And that what we saw unfolding was that there also was this microcosm of Israeli society, Israelis, Palestinians, religious people, secular people, folks who don't normally mix, mixing in an unusual way. And we sort of followed the journey of a few individuals who were staying in the hotel in particular. So maybe starting off with Hotel Corona, Daniel, could you maybe tell us a little bit about how you stumbled upon this story, how this came in front of you?
I found it on Instagram. And we talk about it right at the very, very beginning of the episode. I follow an Israeli comedian on Instagram. Her name is Noam Schuster Eliassi. I had met her about a year ago through a mutual friend and started following her on Instagram and have been watching as her career has been, kicking off. She traveled to Harvard to do a fellowship to work on her stand-up, and then I would just watch her Instagram stories as the pandemic was sweeping through the world. She was telling her Instagram audiences very tearfully that she was heading back to Israel and ending her scholarship, ending her time in Harvard. And lo and behold, she comes back to Israel and catches the coronavirus on the way. I watched her on Instagram as she was in the hospital for several days. And then I remember, just like the rest of us, sitting on the couch with nothing to do under lockdown, scrolling through Instagram, and I see her in a hotel, and she's going to a Zumba class where all these people with coronavirus are in the hotel lobby and they're doing Zumba together. And I mean, it was just video after video like this on her Instagram. It was addictive to watch because you're at home under lockdown, and all these sick patients with COVID-19 are in a hotel together, and they get to sunbathe together because they're all sick, so they can't infect each other. And the local news here started covering these Corona hotels and showing, wow, look how much fun everyone's having. And so I remember one of the NPR international correspondents, we have a daily Zoom chat, and we bounce around different ideas. And I said, hey, has anyone else seen this phenomenon around the world of hotels where COVID-19 positive people are all hanging out and having fun? And there were some examples in China, but so it was a great story. And I pitched it and sold it to NPR as a 2.5-minute postcard for one of the news shows.
Right. Initially, this was not intended in your mind to be this like long form narrative piece. You were thinking about like, how do I get it on a news magazine?
Exactly, because this was a time when all of us correspondents were feeling that we had to kind of compete for airtime because the pandemic was a global story, and things that were happening in my patch were happening everywhere else. And these 2.5-minute postcards seemed to be a really good chance to get on the air during a very busy news time. And then what happened was I started talking with Noam and kind of preparing my 2.5-minute story. And Gregory found out independently about the hotel and about this comedian, and found out that through that I was starting to work on a story about it. And he said, hey, how about we take a stab at this as an episode for the podcast? And that was the first time that it dawned on me that this could be a great long form story.
So that maybe, Gregory, then how do you know when like something that could be just a 2.5-minute news story actually, has the potential for a long form narrative story, maybe in general, but with this pitch in particular?
Yeah, so in general, I mean, one of the phrases that I just certainly didn't make this up, but I've heard is the difference between like a still photo and a film. Kind of a news magazine story can be a still photo. It's a snapshot. it can be a very vivid snapshot, but with a podcast, there needs to be some kind of arc, some kind of momentum, somebody has to change. And so that was one of the first conversations Daniel and I had, like, is there enough sort of change and who would change? And we can get into those character questions. And then the other thing I think that weighs a little bit heavier on the podcast as well as and unlike the news story, is that it mean more than just what it is. It's not just a story about a hotel corona, fascinating as that is. It's also, you know, a bigger story about Israel. It's about the nature of, well, we get into like reality shows and whether people can get along normally and the sort of meaning of that. And in that way, actually, we'd been looking at another story, which was about a hostel, just a regular old hostel somewhere where different people had shown up and they planned to spend, you know, a couple of days or whatever in that hostel and then move on to whatever country they were going to go to. And then because of coronavirus, they all were quarantined in that hostel. And so that idea of being stuck together with people that you didn't get along with or didn't know was already in my mind, because we had talked about it on the show, or we talked about it as a team. And so then when Daniel, and I was thinking of it as like a Gilligan's Island kind of story, like, you know, 7 people caught on go out for a 3-hour tour and end up in this like years-long journey together. And so this felt like a Gilligan's Island kind of story. So it would naturally lead to certain questions that we could ask each other.
I would say that, you know, I've reported 2 long-form narrative stories recently for NPR, and both of those stories were born out of a freelancer's approach. I was a freelancer for a very long time, and they were passion projects. They were stories that I just had, that gripped me, and that I was gripped by, and I followed for years. One of them is a true crime whodunit, and another one is sort of a spy thriller that we did turn into a rough translation episode. It's called The Man Who Sedated Eichmann. And so those, you know, sometimes there are stories that you believe in and you follow and you just have a gut feeling about it. And then there are stories that just take you by surprise, like, huh, this is a long form narrative. And that was the experience for me, because only after we started doing the reporting and talking to the people in the hotel did I understand how many, just how layered and how rich the story was.
Right. In some ways, part of what was so interesting about this story is it was kind of the Gilligan's Island thing that Gregory was talking about, but overlaid on top of that was the complexity of Israeli society and the tensions there. And so there was like this added element of how is this going to go? Because it's not just like strangers who don't know each other, it's strangers who, like, in the outside world wouldn't have known each other and might not get along. So yeah, I mean, this
actually,
is
Tina, I remember
yeah.
I remember you commenting on that, and because I think you had just joined the team when we started working on this story, and you were saying, oh good, this is not, you said, just a coronavirus story. This is a story about Israel and society, and so you were excited that it was actually about the place. So I was keen on that and leaning into that.
Yeah, there were a bunch of things about this story that appealed to us, in part because we had been sort of like immersed in the COVID-19 news cycle for so long. Like, this was both like not just about coronavirus, and it was also like amazingly cheerful, which I think, you know, felt like such a relief to me as a producer, first of all, but also just as somebody who had been, you know, consuming news, is to actually have a story that was, you know, it's not like it was uncomplicated, but to have a story that wasn't just about the terror of this time, but that was about something more uplifting, was really appealing. I don't know about for you guys.
Well, the cheeriness of the story is a question, is a matter of taste. It's I mean, we can get into this more later, but it is interesting how some people see this as a very heartwarming, happy story about people getting along, whereas other people, especially Israelis or those who understand the conflict and the nature of it find it to be very sad, and bittersweet, actually.
Well, we'll
Yeah,
definitely come. Oh, go ahead, Daniel.
Well, I'll just add, yeah, I mean, while we're on this subject, we were reporting the story as the story was happening, as the characters were still there. We were trying to figure out what was this story. And for me, I never went into the story thinking, let's tell a feel-good story. And we can talk more later about how we how we closed out the story, but the way that people reacted to the story was almost like a parable. There was even a pastor in Illinois who wrote a sermon about Hotel Corona, about our episode, and emailed me a copy of the sermon, and talking about the characters in our podcast as if they were disciples of Jesus or characters and I'm totally serious. And it was fascinating because it really was a story that sort of elevated this narrative from just a news story to being a kind of mirror, a reflection of what listeners bring with them as they listen to the story. So if a listener was really craving a dose of optimism during this pandemic, they found that in our story. As Gregory was saying, Israelis, Palestinians, Middle Easterners who heard the story heard something completely different. They heard devastation. It stirred up a lot of emotions for them about what is possible. Can Israelis and Palestinians get along outside of an enclosed hotel, and the reality that the outside world is not like the world that we describe in Hotel Corona. So there was it really was, it was a reflection of it. It was a mirror, and it brought out what listeners were feeling. I think that was the reaction that we got.
Yeah, I was more referring to, like, as a reporter, and like talking to people who were doing Zumba felt like a refreshing change. But apparently the tension between the, like, sort of potential for uplift here and the reality of the situation is, like, flowed through into even how listeners were receiving it. Going back a little bit to the sort of way Rough Translation frames a story differently than a news show, Gregory, when you're looking for material, like as we started reporting the story, tell us a little bit about, like, what you're looking for that you think would not be how the reporting of a news story would go. Like, what makes this process and what you're looking for different?
Yeah, I think that, well, I want to talk, we'll keep it on Hotel Corona. We'll talk very specifically about sort of the choices that we made there. Although I am aware that sort of a story like Hotel Corona, it does feel very special. And it's, I can imagine if somebody's struggling with tape or thinking about whether their news story can work as a narrative podcast, you may think, oh, well, if it's a Hotel Corona kind of story, then it's maybe it's easier, but what if I have a pile of tape and it feels more newsy? So I will give a different example before we get back to Hotel Corona, just because I've been on both sides of this, both the news reporter and I guess the podcaster. So when we did our first season, we did an episode on Ukraine. This was about fake news in Ukraine, Ukraine versus fake news. This was our second episode. I had lived in Ukraine. I'd reported in Ukraine. I learned, Russian and accordion in Ukraine. I have like a lot of like feelings toward Ukraine and like some experience reporting there. So when I went back in 2017 to report this story about fake news, in some sense, that authority or that experience, it did mess with me. And I had this experience where I went out to the front. The front at the time was sort of in the eastern Ukraine, in front of the war against Russia. And I interviewed this guy. Sort of hard to reach him. I found this guy. It was a news seller. He was perfect for the story. He gave me a nice interview, literally over his while selling newspapers. And I thought, this is incredible. I can't believe I'm literally talking to this guy. He's perfect. I packed up my stuff and headed all the way back to Kiev. And then I was on the phone with my editor and I said, this is great. I have this great interview with this guy. And she says, well, how much time did you spend with him? I said, about maybe 45 minutes. It was really great stuff. And already I felt the wheels coming off. And I said, yeah, and I got this and that. And she said, well, and the more questions she was asking me, I realized I had just totally slipped back into reporter mode. And in reporter mode, you're looking for just a kind of a snapshot. You're looking for a person who exemplifies something, and they not that they prove a point, but they sort of stand for something that then you can talk about, and then it's done. You're done with them. Like you may not need anything more. Whereas for a podcast, you actually need to know them, and they need to enter your story, and they need to have a life before the story, and you know that well enough so that when they walk into the story, you can walk in their shoes, and they don't just stand there as the news seller spouting fake news, and they don't just stand for one thing. They are a fully rounded person. So I think that the biggest thing we just tried to do with Hotel Corona was try to make all these characters fully rounded people and try to ask them enough questions so we just knew a lot about them. And so that was true definitely with Noam, as well as Aisha, and then the restaurant, the hotel reservation manager, Baruch. Yeah, it was literally, and then a lot of the stuff we knew about them, we didn't even use, but we just had to know all this different stuff. And then we tried to figure out what of their backstory, would make sense to include and to give that momentum.
Right, that there's a depth that with Noam, I think we had at least 2, maybe 3 multi-hour interviews with her at various stages in her process. And that we also, there was an element of this story that when we started reporting it, everyone was still in the hotel. And then we kept up with them as they left the hotel. And Daniel, I know that initially you had thought that we've got to get this out before they leave, sort of in newsmaker mode, right?
Oh yeah, there was, I remember a moment when Noam, the comedian in the hotel, texted me and she said, I've got my first negative test. I tested negative for COVID, and one more test that's negative, and then I'm out of here. So, and you get into that sort of news person mode where I remember telling Gregory, let's get this story out now because it's hot, it's relevant. We have the news peg, which is as a daily news reporter, you're always looking for the news peg. What is it relevant today, and will this story become stale next week? And luckily, Gregory and the rest of you guys had more patience than I did, because we followed the characters our main characters until they left the hotel, and until they had some chance to reflect on it. And as in daily news reporting, right? Any story you tell is just this fleeting picture and a fleeting moment, and it's always hard to decide how much more reporting do you put in it. And I guess with this story, it was very much, we had to answer the question, what is the story that we're telling? And then, have I gotten what I need? And the story that we decided that we were telling was a story of an experience in a hotel that had transformed the people in it. And you need that time to figure out, have they been transformed? And so the outcome was a story that we could tell from start to finish, from the very first moment that the guests entered the hotel until the last moment when they left and had a chance to reflect. And when the hotel was closing. and saying goodbye to its last COVID-19 patients. And that, I think, brings a sort of timelessness to the story, that it can live on as a full story, as opposed to something that I feel like we did as a news story in the moment.
Let's talk about those characters. Oh, sorry, Gregory.
No, I just want to underline, to the degree in which this is like tips and tricks, I guess one of the points is it just the, how important it is. And Daniel just said, I'm just underlining it, how important it is to literally go back to the characters. And I mean, like, in fact, with Ukraine, when I was there in Kiev, I got back on the train and went back to the front lines, hired again the security, like it was like the whole thing. And I found the guy again. He was like, "You're back." I brought him a lot of chocolate, but yes, and then I ended up spending a ton of time with him and making him into a fuller character. But similarly with this, it's like I don't think that the one interview alone, or maybe if it's a really long interview, but especially with characters who you really need to figure out where are they coming from and take that time. So that's been incredibly important.
Yeah. So speaking of characters, let's talk about how we figured out who this was to be focused on. I mean, Noam was an obvious person because she was the way in that Daniel had found, and she was immediately, funny and articulate and having an interesting experience. But how did sort of we settle on Aisha and Baruch and Gregory? I know that there's an experience that you have at Rough Translation with people who are not amazing English speakers, and how to sort of navigate helping them show up as equally strong characters within a podcast episode as the more fluent English speakers. So maybe throw to you first to talk about that.
Yeah, no, definitely. And then, I mean, Daniel came with the characters, and he had chosen. So I do want to hear how Daniel arrived at that reporting choice. But just, yes, I have I feel very strongly about this subject. I gave a talk at Third Coast a number of years ago. I guess it's an archive talk about the tyranny of good talkers. The idea of that talk was that, a lot of times if you're pitching something to a podcast, people will say, well, is he or she a good talker? And I think that what that often means is the person sort of able to express themselves, self-aware. Also, I guess it can mean, are they good at speaking English? But I think it mostly has to do with, can they speak in a way that I can relate to what they're saying, and follow, be part of their story. And it involves a certain kind of awareness of how Americans tell a story and what they choose to include or not include. And so I've always felt like if we just are looking for good talkers, we do miss a lot of people, and we cut a lot of people out of the story. So in this case, Noam is a really good talker. She's hilarious. She's incredibly funny. She's a comedian. She's also an essayist, writes for, I mean, she knows her story. She knows how to express herself. She's fun to listen to for sure. Aisha is younger. She's the 19-year-old Bedouin woman, and her English is not as good. She's not as practiced in how to communicate to, say, an international crowd. She's a hospital janitor, and yet she is the emotional heart of the story. I think we kind of decided on it. Like she's the one who changes throughout the whole story. And so one of the things that we always are trying to do is, how do you use, in some sense, how do you not counterbalance that? If you have a really good talker, if you have somebody who you're going to have to need to write around their words or figure out how to frame them better, how do you bring them into the story and not make it feel out of balance? In fact, how do you, in some ways, Aisha was the main character, if there was one. And so I think that what we tried to do with this story is frame the story with Noam, but bring Aisha in crucial moments that, with her backstory and with her perspective on the situation, and sort of make sure that her perspective was really centered. But let me ask Daniel, like, how you came up with this, folks.
Yeah, how did you find
Right.
it?
Well, I mean, this gets to the whole challenge of reporting in the time of a pandemic, where the place you're reporting on is a place you literally cannot enter. We could not enter that hotel because it was surrounded by military and checkpoints. The Israeli military was actually running these hotels. And if you were not COVID-19 positive, you just did not want to go in there. So it was a real exercise in patience on the part of our main characters. Noam, was totally gung-ho about telling a deep story about her experience. While she was in the hotel, she was telling us that she was going through so many different feelings and emotions about what was happening inside there. And I asked her to scout out some other interesting people who we could speak to. She recommended Aisha. And so we were just really lucky to have that recommendation and to have Noam's, we had that buy-in. There was one point where I baked cookies and I brought them to the hotel because, well, pandemic, what are we doing but baking a lot? And I was. So I drove to the hotel and there was a way to deliver items to the hotel. You had to put it in a bin, and then a couple times a day they would bring items into this, this quarantined area. But it was an excuse for me not only to, the closest thing that I could do was to actually to see what it looked like from the outside and get a sense of what it was, but then also have some kind of rapport with the people who we were talking with. And I guess it's also a lesson in just the more people you speak to, the more full, the fuller story you can tell. I mean, we could have just stopped with Noam and Aisha, but I think it was Gregory's idea to speak to the hotel reservation manager, but that just added a whole completely different outlook, right? A different gaze, a different perspective. From there, we spoke to a religious Jewish resident of the hotel who was also sick and who plays a key role in the story. And yeah, I mean, that's just reporting 101 is that everyone tells a bite of this story.
We have a question from a listener, a live listener. And the question is, how did you reach the decision about Aisha's role in connecting distance residents, that she should be the key? That's the question. How did you decide on her as the key, as like bridging the gap, meeting residents at that breakfast scene?
Well, yeah, I could start that. So I mean, the theme of the story, the theme of the piece is that there are these lines, somewhat invisible fault lines, but sometimes very visible between different strata of society. And she, being the first resident, sort of witnesses that. And we had her. I mean, she came down to the dining room and started seeing all the different people, the new guests who were arriving in Hotel Corona. All sitting with their own. The secular was sitting with the secular, the Orthodox were sitting with the Orthodox, the Arabs were sitting with the Arabs. And so that was where her backstory really came in. And she came at this with a desire to connect. In fact, I think it was an interesting choice and very nice. I mean, when Daniel came with these characters, one way of telling the story would clearly be to get the kind of the Orthodox Jewish guy or settler type, and you have maybe an Arab who is on the other side of the spectrum, and you have these two people that totally don't get along, and then surprise, surprise, they actually get along, and they make friends. I mean, that could be a different kind of story. I think that would be equally good. I don't mean to diss on that story, but the problem with that version of the story, and this is to the credit that Daniel came with the characters he did, is that would suggest that Hotel Corona was this wonderful place that had brought the most unlikely people together, and it would, in a sense, do the same crime as so many of the kind of photo ops that well, Noam in the story makes fun of, these pancakes for peace. So the fact that Aisha I mean, obviously there's diversity here. Aisha is Palestinian, Noam is Jewish. The fact that our Palestinian character came in very much desirous to meet everybody and to make everybody get along was, first of all, counter to maybe some stereotype, which is always fun. But then secondly, everybody's not acting in their sort of stereotypical role. Aisha is Aisha. She has her own view on what things are. She's got her own learning experiences. We both wanted to balance the political realities of Israel and talk about very much this segregated society, but also talk about who Aisha was and whether she, her view on that was, hey, I really want to talk to different people. I want to figure out, I want to use this opportunity to meet people. And so for all those reasons, it was not stereotypical. It was the thing that set up the conflict and then, of course, introduced Aisha in this very active way. It felt like a natural.
So speaking of Aisha, I've got some tape pulled, both raw tape from an interview that Daniel and Gregory did, and then this final scene that it turned into, because I think part of this collaborative environment of reporting and producing is that you really are sort of navigating these interviews together, and this also sort of harkens back to what Gregory was saying about how do you listen for what Aisha is saying, and then can help sort of construct the scene so that what she is saying shines through. And so there's an interesting evolution that happens between the raw interview and the scene. So do you guys want to say anything before I play a little bit of tape from that?
I will just say that part of our process is that after we do an interview, we'll convo about what we thought were the best moments of the interview. And I think and we often do that sort of with you and I, or the producer and the editor involved. So I think, Tina, you weren't in that interview with Aisha.
I wasn't
remembering.
And you were telling me about it afterwards.
So I was telling you about it, and yeah, it's interesting. I was like, and then she told this amazing story, and then you sent me a note. You said, "Wow, I think we're gonna have to help her tell that story because it's there, but yeah, we have to help her tell that story, and it's all there. What did you mean by that?"
Yeah, in some ways, it's like Gregory had come off of the interview on this kind of high of like, she told us all of these amazing things. And so I, with my like producer brain was like going into it, expecting glittering tape of like, her unfolding this amazing story, which was there. But, it kind of came like Gregory and Daniel do this like circling around the story in order to get out the details that ultimately like fleshed it out into this thing. And, when you listen to the raw tape, I'm not going to play that whole section because it's, like there's an extended, we're just going to listen to the beginning of it, but you start to see the story sort of like filtering out. And I really appreciated the way that, post-interview, Gregory was already synthesizing the way that it had sort of come together, even though it required like sort of pulling all of these little details from her. So let's listen to a little bit. So this is, if you have listened to the episode, this is the story of the young man who fainted, was having an asthma attack, and Aisha was helping him. So we're going to hear a little bit of the raw tape, and then I'll play the scene that ended up in the final episode.
There's someone that he got the asthma, and he's young. And
asthma?
Yeah, I called to MEDA here, and
the medics.
Yeah, the medics, and I stayed with him like for half an hour, and I helped him.
He had an asthma attack?
Yeah, and he had the coronavirus.
So that's extra dangerous if you have
Yeah,
asthma attack.
and the medical had a lot of time to come here, like 1 hour. So I started with him all the time, like wake up, don't sleep. I was talk to him all the time, and I ask the medical what I have to do and all this stuff.
That was inside the hotel?
Yeah.
And the medics took a while because they had to get into their hazmat suits and their PPE.
Yeah, they talk for him like 1 hour to wearing all this stuff they have to put.
So what did you do that was during that hour?
I was all the time connect with the medical, like keep him awake, put some stuff on him, like if he had a heart or מה זה כאבי גרון?
If his throat hurt.
Yeah.
Or if he
Were you
has a fever.
Yeah.
Chom. Yeah.
Were you scared?
Actually, no.
Huh. Had you ever done anything like that before?
I see in the hospital all the time people like dying. So it's not that hard to see someone getting an asthma.
And was this, I don't know, just a Jewish guy or Arab guy?
A religion Jewish guy.
Oh.
Yeah.
Religious Jewish guy.
Yeah.
Wow, how old?
33.
Did you know him before that?
No, and he was alone in the room. So when I helped them and they took him to the hospital, I go up there and tell the other Jewish guy, like, go check him if he feel all right, if he needs something, all the time. Like, I'm a Muslim. I cannot talk to him. I cannot touch him. Maybe you can help.
Oh, you had to do all this without touching him?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I respect him. He's a religion Jewish guy. Like, maybe it's not allowed for me.
Was he awake? Did he know you were helping him?
I think he's when he saw me, think that I'm Jewish because the hijab.
Yeah.
So that helped.
Okay. You guys get a general sense of, the story like is actually coming out that he's religious and all of this stuff happened. So let's listen to the scene as we actually had it unfold.
So sure, the people here could share a joke or even a photo, but how would these new friendships hold up under stress? Well, Aisha remembers this one day she was walking back to her room and this guy in front of her collapses.
He's looked like Vincent van Gogh.
He's gaunt, pale, and bearded. He's a young Orthodox Jew, now having an asthma attack on the hallway carpet. And as Aisha rushes over to help, she also stops and wonders, am I allowed to touch him?
Like, I'm a Muslim. I cannot talk to him. I cannot touch him.
Maybe if I help him, he'll be offended. So she calls the medics, but they have to put on all this protective equipment just to enter the hotel. They need her to step in.
And I ask the medical what I have to do.
Don't let him fall asleep, they tell her.
Do you think you saved his life?
Actually, maybe, I don't know. But maybe he doesn't want anybody to know that.
To know what? Like that he had an attack or that you helped him or?
Both of them.
At first, she didn't even tell anyone what she'd done. She didn't want to offend them. Then she worried maybe he'd have another attack, so she started telling people. And this older Jewish nurse told her she'd done something really great.
She told me you can be a doctor, not a nurse, when she talked to me.
Aisha confessed to her that she'd always dreamed of being a nurse, not just a hospital janitor.
And we started this conversation like, maybe we can help each other.
Aisha had never had a mentor outside her family, let alone a Jewish mentor.
You guys want to jump in and talk about the evolution process of this? Because that starts to lead us into how do we start scripting things together.
Oh, I just think it's amazing to listen to that. And it's a reminder of just what interviewing is like. You are just having a conversation with someone, and you could hear how that just sort of unfolded. And good that Gregory asked, who was this guy? Was he an Arab guy or a Jewish guy? And that ended up being a central plot point, where we learn how she is put to the test in this hotel. So yeah, it's so important to just have that time with someone I think it was probably an hour or so before she told us that story. Right, Gregory?
Yeah, and I think it is very interesting to listen to that raw audio, because what's to me very important is that she's just telling it like another story. She's not saying, well, guys, there's this one time and when this Jewish guy collapsed and I had to think about what should I do. She's kind of, we have to pull that out of her, and she's not presenting that story to us on a platter or anything. So that's kind of, about the good talker thing. Her English is perfectly great. I mean, she's completely thoughtful and emotional and thinking through, but she's not trying to frame the story for us. She's just telling the details. And if we don't ask if he's a Jewish guy, we'll never kind of know that part of it. Whereas that was so important. It literally became the thing that allowed her to have a mentorship. And that's what she says that she gained from the Corona Hotel. So yeah, very important to us.
And when we're scripting, this is like a sort of collaborative process involving all four of us on this call. Both Gregory and I are working with the tape. We're involving Daniel in the writing. Lou comes in to help give us guidance and feedback, both sort of on the micro level and on the macro level. Daniel and Gregory, do you want to talk a little bit about like navigating differences of opinion on the script, or how we sort of hash out this process as a team?
I'll jump in very briefly just to say my experience, and then, I mean, you guys have worked with so many other reporters. It is a really intensive process that is not at all like the daily stories that I do for NPR's shows. We have something that you guys like to call a brain dump. So I'll get into my recording booth, which is this closet right over here, and we'll talk for a couple hours about the characters that we've been interviewing and what the story is. Some of those bits of conversation end up in the final version of the podcast. A lot of it is just us trying to talk through what the themes are. You guys did the heavy lifting on a first script, writing out the script. And then it is really just draft after draft, going through both, the big picture stuff, trying to figure out themes, and line by line, is this the right word? It's a very intensive, collaborative, and deeply satisfying in the end process.
Lou, you haven't gotten a chance to talk, but I definitely want a little of your perspective on this, especially like how to keep the big picture in mind as we're like in the weeds of like what's going on with Aisha in this story,
Can you just ask me that as a question, just because I was live tweeting, so I'm a little unfocused.
Sure. Like, a story like this that has a bunch of different characters woven together.
Yeah.
What are the bigger picture things that you're trying to keep in mind as we're in the weeds of it?
Well, I think with this one of the things was that was hard, and that was a real worry at the beginning, was that, there really wasn't this giant crisis, right? Like it mainly ended okay. And that there wasn't, that moment when someone changes in their heart, like their whole perspective changes and they see the world anew. We didn't have that. And that does that kind of structure drives a lot of American storytelling podcasts. And so I think at the top we were really just trying to think like, how do we, keep it moving and keep the listener with us knowing that we don't have that, like, A, we don't want to create artificial conflict where there is none, and B, we don't have that epiphany kind of moment. And so for me, I hearkened back to something that Scott Carrier once told me. And he was just like, there's two kinds of stories. And there's the first story that I just kind of told you about with this epiphany kind of moment. And then he said, and then there's that kind of story that's really about like tension and timing. It's just kind of tension and timing. Like you, and, a lot of kind of European style like montage pieces are made with tension and timing. And if you know Scott Carrier's work, he was really talking about this one piece, The West Desert, which was very difficult for him to get aired, if I remember correctly, because it didn't have that story structure you're looking for. So I had this in my head that like, nope, you can make a great story that people will stay with if you have this idea of tension and timing where something might happen and then maybe doesn't, or it lands. And I think that is true. Like, I think it worked in the end because one of our listeners before the episode went to air was Robert Krolich, and he described he's like, wow, the first half of that piece, it was just drunk. Like, it was totally drunk, but it totally worked, but he was like, I was all over the place, but like that it held him. And so then I felt like, oh, good, we've like done our job. Cause that was kind of my hope. And I was very grateful when he didn't say, that's a disaster, get rid of that.
That actually leads into like the, some things that like were challenging for us. And that Lou, I feel like you were like, doing a great job of like giving us various directions to head in. And that's like the ending of this story and also the beginning of this story. Gregory, do you want to jump in and talk about toppers and endings? And in a minute, we will turn to answering other questions. So there's a little bit of a delay. If folks want to put their questions in the chat, we will get to them after talking about endings and beginnings.
Cool. Yeah, beginnings and endings. Those are kind of some of the hardest bits. I do want to just flag something that Daniel said, just because it leads to this, which is that he said it is very collaborative, the work. And so one of the challenges we've had, or sort of opportunities we've had on the show, is that we have a core team of rough translation that makes rough translation, and then we're often working with the NPR's international desk. So we have a reporter coming in on the team. Daniel's worked with us before, but again, they're like a new member, and so every time it's sort of 3 + 1, or I guess 4 + 1. And what's interesting about that, so this is I guess the theme of this is about turning news stories into podcasts, or finding the podcast narrative in news sources. To me, news stories are generally done alone. You're out there, you make your story, and then you show it to an editor, and then like you kind of fix it up, and it's done. The collaborative process of this is so exposing, and one of the things can be, it's one thing to kind of show it to your editor, or you and your producer are kind of chatting about what to do, but if you show it to the reporter and they've trusted you with this story, you're turning in a draft which is not yet good, and you don't want them to feel like, what have you done with my story? Like, you've made it horrible. Like, the writing is not yet there. The transitions are kind of obviously very mannered, the tape. And so the trust process of being able to all listen and put constructive kind of comments in the Google Doc. And then, by the way, what I think is extremely important is that we show, or we play our piece for listeners, very diverse listeners. We try to figure out who is going to react to this particular story. We obviously wanted to play it for Palestinians, wanted to play it for Israelis, we wanted to play it for people who cover that region, who are very versed in that topic. We wanted to play it for people who completely don't know the region. And so every time we would do that, it's letting yet somebody else into your circle, letting somebody else see your mistakes, and being willing to be told we kind of got something wrong. But that's good in order that the broader public doesn't quite see all that, and that we make it, I think, for everybody. So the ending was very much a question of that. It's what are we saying at the ending? We definitely didn't want this to be, wow, isn't this great? Everyone got along, and this might be the solution to the Israeli peace process or something like that. But on the other hand, we didn't want to do the kind of reporter thing like, well, anyway, obviously that's not going to mean anything, because it did mean something deep to the characters. So it was, it was almost like it's like a calibration of how much of the sadness, how much of the bit of the minor key were we going to play at the end. And we talked a lot about it, and I think we even were fiddling with it literally until the final hour.
We kept trying different endings.
Yeah, and even when we had the ending, we had Baruch's, like, whatever it is, like, let's say it's 4 cuts, we had 5 cuts, and then we just reduced it down to 4 and maybe just 3.5. So it's that, I think of it as musicality, frankly. So that was one of the factors. And then the beginning, I think similarly, was about framing this piece straight up, not as sad coronavirus, like we are going to sort of immediately have fun, because that's what drew Daniel into the story. But also we were going to frame it politically, and Daniel was right away going to talk about Israel being a segregated society, and that was what was interesting to him. So he comes with that knowledge. It also sort of focuses on Daniel as an authoritative guide to this, which is another thing we're always trying to do at Rough Translation. And so bookending that what happens inside the hotel, we were sort of bookending with the realities outside the hotel, and which are so different and so complex, but in order that you would understand this in context. So that ended up being what we were thinking about, but it took quite a long time to kind of get to that and figure out that that's what we were trying to do.
We do have a question from Martin. Lou talked about the desire for a transformative moment in US audio storytelling. How does that expectation affect the way people make stories in the US, or the way that stories are told here? Anybody want to go for that?
I mean, I do think that I don't know, yeah, but the transformation, I don't know, but I will say just 2 quick things. One is that I think that I don't know, but I feel like we're a quieter kind of show. We certainly try to entertain you and keep you along for the ride and all that, but I think that our show, we are willing to have stories that are more quietly dramatic. Maybe they're just dramatic to the person. And because I think we're trying to frame stories about a person against the backdrop of big events, oftentimes what is quietly dramatic for them is significant in our understanding of what's going on in the world. So so it's not a story often about news events, but nor is it so intensely psychological that it's just about that one person. And I think because it is the balance of those things, we're able to get away with stories that are a little less dramatic and maybe wouldn't make the cut on some podcasts. And I'm actually kind of proud of that, because I feel like it is nice to give a home to those stories.
Yeah, and there is, I feel like what's evident in the question that Martin asked, as somebody who's not in the US, is that there is this pull towards that kind of story as the kind of story, and that figuring out other shapes and giving a home to stories that are not always that, I think is really important. We have a couple of other questions here. Sort of relatedly, if someone pitched you the Hotel Corona story as is, more tension timing, less protagonist, epiphany driven, would you consider it? Which that kind of leads into like what we do look for in pitches, and from outside reporters. I think this is you again, Gregory, as the.
I'm trying to understand the question.
if it was pitched sort of as the story as it came to be, would we have? Oh, Lou, do you want to jump in?
Well,
I mean,
yeah,
I think
like
we knew
I used to before you know, when I was pitching to shows on a regular basis, like I feel like, and when you're freelance and you're pitching to shows that have a real specific way, who look for that epiphany drive. First of all, it's real, like that epiphany driven story in the States is like a real thing. It's many shows, if you don't have it, like they don't even respond to your emails. And so what I started to think of them when I was a freelancer was there were certain stories that were pitchable and there were certain stories that were unpitchable because it didn't have an epiphany, but like you had to just have in your gut that you knew it could work. And just be able to stick with that in your heart somehow, like just knowing, like it's just such a stubborn, risky thing to do. So I used to describe them as unpitchable. When I was a freelancer, I would say they were unpitchable. That some things you just have to do. Now, as a show rough translation, I don't know. Like Gregory, you know the show better than anybody. How do you flesh out a pitch like that? Like how do you see if there's juice there to hold it, you know?
I mean, I will say that I think that the initial conversations that Daniel and I had were we're sort of trying to figure out what are the arc, what are the moments of the story that keep it going forward. And definitely, I will say that the Passover Seder scene. Here's what I'll say. I think that the epiphany can linger anywhere, and the epiphany can actually be in the listener's experience. So the epiphany doesn't have to be the character's epiphany. It can be our thinking differently about characters or a story that we thought we knew. And so if a lot of times if we're holding something up, we're like, wow, there's another way of seeing this, or we're going to find something else about this, and we're going to have the epiphany. That's enough for us. And oftentimes creating, well, anyway, I'm just going to say, like, also the idea of, I think that we talk about on the show is we want to get people curious about the thing they didn't know to be curious about. So oftentimes what we're doing in the beginning of a story is trying to give you enough information and bring that in with character enough so that you're already engaged, you're thinking about this character, and then the epiphany can happen. I mean, it may not be that we don't want to do this story just for people who are focused on the Israeli-Palestinian, conflict. Obviously, that would be limiting to our audience. So I think framing the scenes is still important, and trying to understand change is important. But I do think that change can be subtle.
Another question we've gotten is, what non-audio stories like books or films inform the shape of this piece? And that's from Zach Rosen. Hi, Zach Rosen.
Hey, Zach. I mentioned Gilligan's Island. I don't know if other folks. No, but that really was. And also there's like the Raft of the Medusa kind of.
Well, and actually there was this whole part of the topper that ended up getting cut that was about this Israeli reality show. Daniel, do you want to talk about that?
It was Big Brother, the Israeli version of Big Brother, the reality show that, a lot of you guys know about, which is a story about, which is a reality show about a place where people are handpicked by a producer from all different kinds of backgrounds, and they're put in a house and they're locked in there, and then they have to learn how to get along. And every episode there's someone else who gets voted out, and that was very much like a part of not only the residents inside the hotel would see themselves as in a Big Brother episode. I think that was what brought us to talking about this Hotel Corona situation as a reality show. And I think that, so it's a really good question I think that was the breakthrough when we were trying to figure out what was the story about. This is the reality show but it's like real reality. It's not like the fake reality where a producer is handpicking the people to be in the episode in the show. It's like it's the virus that's picking these people at random, and they are from different backgrounds because this virus is affecting all of humanity. And thinking about what it is like also as a viewer to watch, like me as the viewer watching this on my Instagram screen. It was then on like the Israeli nightly news, the hotel Corona experience. I don't know if you guys have any other thoughts about how we frame, because I think that was the breakthrough that also made the end so perfect, which was that this was a cast of characters.
Well, and also Gregory's remembering interviewing a reality TV show producer about how hard it is to actually manufacture the drama that you think of as a hallmark of as part of that show. I remember that you guys stumbling upon adding that to the end. It just felt like it sort of crystallized something.
Yeah, because it was like the inverse of a reality show, right? I mean, we did use that in the billboard, the idea that it's the reality show where everyone's getting along, but actually that's the real reality. The reality show has to, in some sense, inject the conflict in order to make for reality show, as opposed to reality where people get along. But you hear even me talking about it, it starts to become a mouthful. And so that's why we did end up, I feel like that, Daniel's exactly right. We were thinking about Big Brother. We had a lot of reality TV show references sprinkled, I think, throughout the story. And then we went through and just kind of cut like many of them out, probably because it did seem to sort of cheapen the story or put the story in a box or even get confusing. We started to wonder, okay, well, we think that they're on a reality show. So it was part of like the scaffolding that helped us understand what the story was, but then getting rid of that so we could just let the characters kind of be who they were.
Though also Baruch elected to compare it or say it wasn't like The Love Boat or some movie. That was not prompted. That just came out of him. So in some ways, it was like the bones of that idea were like in the material we were getting too. Yeah. We're over time actually, and so unless there are further questions or any last things that everyone wants to say. All right. Well, it's been a pleasure. There's Martin.
Hi. Thanks everyone, and thanks everyone for tuning in. We're not going to have a stream next week because it's the 4th of July, and I imagine people in the United States are going to be quite busy with one thing or another. And we're going to be back in 2 weeks' time with Crystal de Heimer, but Wintonic. I don't know if that's her name. Really,
That's it.
Really sorry, no. And they're going to be. Their talk is called "Rhythm is a Dancer." It's about timing and structure in audio. So that will be back at the sort of regular time later in the day. So yeah, thanks very much for tuning in. Thanks very much to Lou and to Daniel and to Gregory and to Tina for the talk today. And yeah, if you, I was about to say, if you're not watching this now, you can watch it later, but that makes no sense. Anyway, do another time. Bye.
If you want to watch it again later.
Yes, you can watch it again later. There we go. That's that, and that makes more sense. Excellent. Thanks,
And
Tina.
should we give people the email if they want to pitch us? Rough translation at npr.org. We're always open. Yeah,
and
more.
You're on Twitter too, as well, aren't you? What you
At Roughly.
At Roughly. That's a good handle. Cool. So yeah, so check out more stuff
I
there.
think rough translation is too many characters or something.
Sweet. Great. Bye.
Thank you, everybody.